Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jacqueline, and today I'll be going through the high inflation world scenario, the fourth of our working package of the financial catastrophe. First, I'd like to have a little disclaimer. We did our fintech scenarios, we conceptualized the four scenarios probably a year ago, not knowing what the future will entail. Of course, one of the scenarios high inflation world, and as we realize, we are currently in a non-high inflation world, apparently in a deflationary spiral. So I was talking to my colleague before this. Jay was saying that this probably is one of the most difficult scenarios to describe currently because it's quite intuitive with what in the world that we're living in now. So I hope to actually emphasize the fact that this stress test scenario that we're doing is not a prediction. It is exploring an extreme but plausible scenario, and I hope to convince you that this is still a relevant scenario that we can explore today. Right. So of course, we look at the global inflation rates history from the very beginning when we have information collected. We have seen that we are going through a different cyclical high inflation and low inflation rates. As of recently, we're still seeing very localized high inflation, especially in the emerging markets, not so much of the developed markets. So specifically looking at the year-on-year inflation in the emerging markets, for example, we have in Iran about 40% inflation, Sudan more than 40%, and of course the most famous one is actually in Venezuela, where it's still more than 35% currently as well. Looking at the trend of high inflation, well, from history, we have seen that high inflation rates have actually been decreasing since the 1980s, specifically because of the government's and central banks' constant effort to actually keep inflation rates in check, as well as another more subtle observation that we have seen is actually the high income groups countries are actually having a lower inflation rates than the low income groups. So we can actually see that it explains a stronger commitment by the wealthier countries to actually maintain price stability as compared to the rest. So some of a little more interesting observations that we can actually see. But before I carry on any further, I was told that I need to actually show what inflation is. Well, inflation, as I believe everyone knows, that it's the rate of increase in consumer price index. And we can actually classify inflation by different categories. We can look through coverage, whether it is a comprehensive one, or it's more of a sporadic, it's an exogenous shock on the system, whether it is a wartime inflation or a peacetime inflation or not, whether it's a government-controlled, an open economy, or a suppressed. Rate of inflation is interesting. It's actually looking at the rate of increase in the price increase. So it's more like a second derivative of price increase. But anyway, we have creeping, we have chronic, we have moderate, running, galloping, and of course we have the hyperinflation that basically just a different type of explaining inflation. Anticipated and unanticipated inflation brings about very different outcome in the system. Of course, with an anticipated inflation, the public knows how to react, and of course, the outcome will not be as drastic as it seems. But today, we will only going to be focused on the type of cause of inflation, particularly a cost push or supply side inflation in our scenario. So, how does our scenario play out? This is a Cassandra newsletter developed in-house by the Risk Center, our journalist and editorial team, headed by Tamara. Sorry. But anyway, you'll find more information on our reports. So what happens is the rising urban population, or rather the rising global population, actually pushes or threatens our world food security. We all know that we're heading towards 9 billion world population in 2050. So it's increasing at an explosive rate. Of course, we have to look at how we can provide food for every one of us, especially consumerism in the wealthier developed countries are not helping at all. But let's not go into that. Next, we have, in our scenario, the phase 2 scenario, we have a B decline faced by climate change, extreme weather conditions, which we have seen recently in the past 4 weeks, I believe, in the UK. We've been battered by 3 storms. Imagine how will that actually affect harvesting, not today, but the entire seasons for next year, for example. How will that actually affect the bee population, for one, and how will it affect harvest for a second point. Exacerbating agricultural crops shortage will not help when we're wanting to feed more people on our earth. And on the other side of the world currently, we are known to be facing a more radical world. In our scenario, we imagine a world where our global oil supply will be controlled and restricted by the separatist group. So up to, say, 20%, in our scenario, up to 20% of this world supply will actually be suppressed by this group, this extremist group, which means we're actually having 20% less supply to actually go around, fueling our consumption, fueling the entire food distribution, transportation network. So further strengthening the food energy spiral cost effect, price effect. So, next. Mentioned that it is actually a cost push scenario. What are the key transmission mechanisms that will be described? So looking at the cost push inflation, we note that there are two different types of two different types of trigger. One can come from the domestic trigger, and one from the more open economy, import side effect. So we want to look at the domestic inflation that are actually affecting inelastic goods, simply because these are the goods that do not have a good substitute. So when prices are affected, prices increase in these inelastic goods, we are not able to switch to some other goods or services. Therefore, we have no choice but to pay more money. This leads to increasing prices, and as what I've mentioned, these are actually driven by the global protectionism, the monopolizing of the oil supply. Natural disasters and environment collapse will actually not be helping. So I'm just basically highlighting where the key transmission mechanisms that will be described, that are described in our scenario. So to put all these narratives into our context, into the macroeconomics, because we want to look at what is the global economy impacts, we have to identify what are the different input variables that we want to shock in the Oxford Economics model. First and foremost, of course, the global energy prices. We shock them accordingly to these extent. And we have to justify our shocks according to, of course, historical precedents. And we have to make certain assumptions in our model. So first and foremost, we look at historical precedents in the 1973, the oil embargo scenario, where we note that the price of oil actually quadrupled to, well, $12 per barrel. Note in mind that before the crisis last year, crisis as in the falling oil prices, we were more than $100 per barrel. So we're not looking at taking the dollar value, but more on the extent of how much our oil price can be increased. So in this case, we're actually shocking the magnitude of the energy prices by up to 400%. But of course, that is in the extreme X1 scenario. And of course, we look at why do we say that a 20% decrease in the oil-rich Middle Eastern group actually will affect this scenario? It's because the OPEC accounts for 40% of the global production of our world energy supply. So therefore, it has a significant impact on our scenario in that sense. What about food? So the most recent world food crisis was actually in line with our 2008 financial crisis. Well, the world population increase from 6.6 to 6.7 billion does not really seem exciting in this particular case study, But note that currently we're at more than 7 billion, and we're basically just gonna increase, or maybe the rate of increase in our population is just gonna be increasing at unprecedented scale. And of course, developing countries have food imports have been increasing by the last few decades simply because they are trying to advance their economy. They are shifting away from the agricultural sector. So they themselves are also facing a lot of different food imports and exports. So the trade, they're further exposing their economy further. And of course, the key assumptions that I've also just highlighted, they are historical precedents to actually describe, for example, the bee colony collapse in 2006 and 7, where in the US there are more than 75% of the bee population collapsing. Although the current situation is that we have recognized this situation and many different countries are rectifying the bee population incident. So nonetheless, looking at the result, this is just one of the key highlights that I have picked out for the scenario. Looking at both the unemployment rates and the inflation rates, and looking at where each country stand before and after the shock. So the blue dots represent the baseline scenario projected by the Oxford Economics model, and the red dots represent the shock in our extreme variable scenario. You can see that the dots, of course, have grown bigger, simply because they're grown more in inflation and as well as unemployment rate. So this brings us back to the 1970s, 80s of the hyperinflation scenario in the US, where we had a long period of stagflation of high unemployment rates as well as inflation rate. So to bring us to the summary of the macroeconomics impact, this scenario, interestingly, do not render a global recession. We're still growing in a positive end, but take note that originally before the scenario occurred, it was growing at close to 3%, but in the worst case scenario, it's less than 1%. So the global economy takes it better, but it is not as severe as the rest of the impact scenarios that we have explored. And of course, looking at the GDP at risk, the common metric that we use to compare across our four scenarios, the worst case scenario is that the global economy will take a beating of, say, 11 trillion. So it fits our $1 trillion threshold of classifying this as a financial catastrophe. And of course, the worst case scenario still do recover, but definitely beyond the 5-year modeling period of our modeling. So bringing into today, how does this scenario actually compare to the world that we're living in today? How does this counterfactual, how will the results differ if this scenario were to happen today? Will it be completely out of sync of what I've just described, or will it be similar, will it be worse? I suppose the beauty of scenario stress testing is such that we have a type of scenario that we want to describe, and it can actually be applied on any underlying economic condition, and the results will be unique to every underlying condition in that sense. So just to show what I feel, the world that we're living in today, we are constantly what I want to describe is basically the Fed rates rising. We have seen for the past half a year that there are signals or noise to actually indicate that the Fed rates are actually rising. So increasing of the Fed rates increases our short-term interest rates, etc., and that has a direct implication to our high inflation world, simply because raising interest rates is one of the first and foremost mitigation measure of any government or central banks to fight inflation rates. But how will that actually affect the scenario? In June, we have signals showing that we're going to increase our rates, and then again in July, we're expecting the rates to increase in September, And then again in August, they say that, you're going to raise rates twice. And of course, in October, economists say that the rates will actually be increased definitely within this year. And just a few days ago, last week, we have the Federation chief, Janet Yellen, to actually signal that the Fed rates will increase potentially end of this month. So how does that actually affect our scenario at the end of the day? So imagine now that the interest rates have increased and the underlying assumption and our key scenario narratives still stands. Climate change is not going to leave tomorrow. It's not going to be, solved in Paris within this week. I'm not that optimistic yet. And we have seen the storm hitting on us. So definitely the high inflation world due to exogenous events can possibly happen. Although I'm not too sure about the oil prices. But who knows? It's an exogenous event that it is beyond our control. So the contractionary monetary policy that governments can do is basically to increase interest rates further beyond the rates hiked by the Feds potentially, and driving the global high inflation rates even higher. Another option, due to my limited economic understanding, is that banks may be required to actually hold more reserves requirements, in the sense that to cover, for example, withdrawals in the event of reducing money supply in circulation, to keep people from spending, to cool down the economy, to restrict economic stimulation. So that adds further stresses to the banks in the banking sector, for example. So however, it does not. Okay, so basically what I feel that in our real world today, our scenarios do definitely stand, and I hope that I can actually convince you that high inflation world has a possibility of happening, not impossible, and the aftermath of this scenario happening today might not be largely different from what we have explored. If not, it could be worse. So thank you so much. That's the end of my talk.